I guess. Yep.
Yeah, just started.
Yep. All right.
You
Well,
thought it
I
was
guess
interesting, Alice. What did you think about it?
I kept trying to decide whether I liked it or didn't like it. It wasn't something where I could say I did or I didn't immediately. And I ordered from the publisher and it just came in yesterday. So I've only read it once. Oh, but he has some things that keep coming back over and over. And Texas must be the weirdest place in the universe. I've thought that from time to time.
fiction.
Yeah, I know, but those feral hogs.
Oh yeah.
The hogs, yeah.
And there were some other animals that were being exterminated.
Dogs, yeah.
Yeah.
What was the poem where the man is, it has to do with the feral hogs being exterminated by poison. And
Hog kaput.
Yeah.
yeah, that one may have been the most intriguing one for me out of the whole thing, because he so very subtly makes you think about us as a species. And I think he does it with the pregnant wife. I think that's really the catch. Oh, but it really makes you consider what you're doing to other life on the planet and how much you're privileging the human as opposed to the inhuman, or animal or vegetable, or that seems to be something that comes up again and again, but I thought it was particularly subtle and poignant in that piece. Anybody else like it?
Yeah, about the time we find the wife is pregnant is when he starts talking about the hogs reproducing.
Yes.
Oh, Alice, that some of that had to do with the idea of immigration also.
Yes.
And there's more than one poem. There's the hog kaput, and then which one was it? An American Tale?
I know there are two or three others.
Yeah, there are a couple of
Some
two
them
or three others.
come up.
Yeah. Cruelties and rain.
The one where is it the dogs that are in the bag? Cruelties.
Yeah.
That's
the American Tale, I think. And
okay.
Cruelties, he's exterminating the wasps.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And then dogs.
Yeah. And then even right in the eye, that's the dogs with the
right in the eye.
back to the scrotum.
Yeah.
The dogs are going to the hog.
Wild hogs. Yeah. So I thought all that was really, well, even I think it's in one of those points he says, my politics are tricky, or rickety.
Yeah.
Which is even a better word, rickety. But, and I think his politics, or whatever that is kind of subtly woven through the book. It's not foregrounded in a way that seems to be in your face, and in the way that a lot of other people's politics or injustices or focus on things like that can be much more forceful. His seems a little more subdued, and sometimes you're not exactly sure, is that an implication about some issue,
Yeah.
Well, like in Hog Kaput on page 48, if you're thinking about immigration, then these lines really seem to fit that. Because some species are invasive, because our country needs protection,
right?
Because we inhabit the land the way an ideal inhabits the mind. We submitted to our proposal to the legislature, hoping that they would understand why it was vital that at all costs, we saw to the elimination of the hogs.
Yeah.
Which really there's something more than the hogs.
Right. Well, on page 118, in An American Tale, on the middle of that page, the idea was to keep some people from polluting our country.
Mm-hmm.
The idea was they had a criminal mentality, an incurable affinity for violence, etc. And those he does this throughout the book, but from the very first poem, the idea of fiction, right? That the evolution, how does he say that? On page 6, at the top of the page, rather, anthropologists now believe modern humans rose, obliterating all other intelligent hominid species because of our ability to create fictions. And so I think it's in that last poem he talks about ideas. And so are ideas fictions? Are ideas viruses? Are ideas invasive? I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud here, but Alice, you look perplexed.
Well, a lot of it I read as satire. Oh, the Committee on Village Security. I
I
thought
like that one a lot.
fantastic.
Yeah.
Oh, and again, it works partially because it's straight. Oh, we can't avoid certain grim necessities, even as we welcome all dissent, productive or not. So rest assured, we have the community's welfare in mind, no matter what you say, no matter what is in your thoughts. Oh, and again, he keeps circling this tendency to exclude and this tendency to exculpate one's own group. And I didn't really see that as fiction. I saw the stories that people tell in exculpation as what the fiction was, and found that he was saying, without saying it, to be
which is the best way to say it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Alice.
No, you didn't. You didn't. Oh, the blueberry one with the drone was just devastating. And there's another one. Oh, I think we've already talked about it a little bit. Oh, his friend he called Charles because he couldn't really pronounce his name.
Yeah.
It's that same kind of vulnerability of the very innocent and the very young. And then you get something like the one where the guy shoots off the rocket and catches the field and the barn and everything on fire. And you think, well, sometimes innocent aren't that innocent.
So he says he's not a confessional poet, but I mean, that one, did that happen? Did he imagine that? He calls it the art of fiction, but the fireworks poem, and there's another one later on, where the girlfriend apparently gets shot in a riot.
Right.
And so where are the cues that tell us which ones are persona poems and where we're actually digging in?
I don't know. The one where the girlfriend got shot reminded me so much of Kent State. It reminded me so much of Kent State that I went and looked to see where he'd gone to school, and it wasn't there. It was Wesleyan, but he did grow up in Ohio. So I think it was a fiction, but
Catherine, on page 102, Faraway Wars, the beginning of that one plays on imagining, right? When I was a boy, I imagined roots twisting around the last few landmines buried in the orchard. And then, but as you read the rest of it, it's as though it's happened. It's happening, but he's imagined this. And I thought the ending of that one was one of the, I mean, there's a lot of great endings in these poems, but that one is so complicated. Those triggers are sensitive, though we know those triggers are sensitive and can withstand centuries, and all the ways in which even ideas, I don't know, there was a thought I had pretty early on in the book, because by the time you reach is it the third or fourth poem, archaeology, the whole look of it on the page is completely different than what we've encountered, right? So the first poem, the art of fiction, fireworks, yeah. So those first two poems are very similar structured on the page, and then you get to archaeology and it's completely different, right? But that got me to thinking about, especially as I kept reading, I kept having that word archaeology in my mind, and then fiction, archaeology, art, I don't know, trying to figure out what he was doing, right? But it seemed to me that in some ways the book is it an archaeology of America? Is it an archaeology of America's fictions, or America's, or even just the ideas? Is an archaeology of the ideas that have shaped us, or shape us in real time? Is an archaeology of ideas that might be fictions, or as I said, an archaeology of fictions that might also be viruses. And I don't know if I have answers to any of those questions. They're just some of the thoughts I had. But even in that archaeology poem, how is one thing handed from one generation to the next? Or because the poem that ends before that one, fireworks, and in this way the young man thought, laying down his book while his father put his boots away in his mother's side. And in this way literature is handed on from one generation to the next. And then you get to art, and then the next poem is archaeology, which I thought was a wonderful transition movement from one poem to the next.
I had doubts about that ending to Fireworks, because what he's just said is that literature is a burning horse running into the next field and setting it on fire. Really? I mean, that seemed a little far-fetched. I mean, that was a great image, but is that real? That does not strike me as how literature is handed from one generation to the next.
Yeah. Well, I do think that he begins that poem with literature being elastic, right?
Yeah.
And so what are the concerns of a generation? Or I don't know. It's a fascinating poem, and I don't know that I read that one 3 or 4 times, actually. Some of these you could read twice, but others 10 times. I do like, though, at the bottom of page 11, well, there's a way to think about what Prufer does in his work. And by the way, I think I've got every book he's ever published. I don't know if y'all are familiar with How He Loved Them, and this came out before this one. And of course, In a Beautiful Country, which I just love, and National Anthem. You can kind of tell a theme. America. Churches came out a few years ago, but these are all 4-way books, and then Fallen from a Chariot and Fingerbone. But I think his mind proceeds, or there is a kind of poem he writes, and his mind proceeds through juxtaposition. And so you'll have these sections, and it'll be about one thing, and then the next section seems to kind of, all right, where did that go? This goes in some other direction, and then he'll circle back and connect to what he began with, perhaps.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Well, which is exactly what he does in the first poem, the title poem, right? The art of fiction kind of weaves these 4 stories back and forth into each other.
Or 5 if you count the poet sitting there writing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, as I was about to say, at the bottom of 11, you know, he's got the fireworks. He starts with great literature. Then you've got the middle section there. You're going to do it, you said. And I said, of course I'm going to do it. And I struck the match, and for a moment, your face glowed yellow in its light. And then I lit the fuse. And then it shifts. His mother died, and later his father died. I mean, this is not a linear, you know, from one stanza to the next. But the idea of I guess the elasticity of great literature and what it might be. I mean, is it the field? I don't know. Maybe it's not the horse running into the field. It could be the field. But, you know, books become a comfort. They become an intimacy. They become a newness.
When we were reading David Kirby, we called this kind of thing braiding.
Braided.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think he's trying to address what a moment or a juxtaposition means. It meant the following. I think he said in some place, like he actually says it meant the following. And what I love about some of these types of moments in his work, even a line like that one, it meant the following. Okay, now he's going to tell us what it meant, or it meant the following, like the things that follow.
Yeah.
There's little moments like that where his lines can be like the implications reach back through multiple poems, and I, you know, obviously love that in all the kinds of books we've discussed. But I think his lines are really rich in that way.
What do you think about so in a lot of these poems that have the lineation of the stanzas kind of chopped up and varied, and then there's this little plus, the little plus sign,
Mm-hmm.
which I was just really interested in, because I don't know that I've seen a little plus sign. You know, sometimes you'll see a little star or a dash or whatever, but it's like, and here's more to the story.
And another thing.
You know, I just really like that. But the pluses don't always end. I mean, like the stanzas don't end always with a complete thought or at a some kind of end punctuation. Sometimes it's a continuation. There's just plus in the middle of it, which is interesting too.
Well, it makes you pause and, you know, live within that stanza, the room of that stanza. And I think, you know, whatever thought is, especially for this particular poet, it is something that is begun, extended, reassessed, layered.
Yeah. I was interested by the lineation of the poems. And I was thinking that maybe he felt he had to space the poems the lines the way he has them, because his writing to me was, well, we know it's not lyrical in that sense. So it probably, if he had just written out the lines like a prose poem, it would have sounded more like prose. And so I'm thinking that's why he did the lines the way he did, and also for effect in the thought process, that each line, he meant for each line to be thought as a thought in our minds.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's what I was thinking about that. Yeah. But I enjoyed the poems, not so much the last few ones, because to me they were highly political, and that's more difficult for me. But he has a poem, The Translator.
Yes.
And since I have done some translations, I really could identify with it. And I love that he thought of it as a dead body of a foreigner, because how when we translate, the question always is, do we want to translate word for word, or by the feeling that the line brings to the poem? And so I just thought that was an incredible poem for me to. The only thing, if you wanted to look at that poem, on page 35, on page 36, he introduces a young woman. Here I am out here. I can see your oil wicks glittering on the horizon, says the young woman whom no one listens to. And then she reappears on page 39. But what is there to say about the young woman still clinging to the wreckage 2 days into my poem? And I wasn't sure. I know the poem is written in metaphor, but so I wasn't sure who that poem, who that woman signified in the poem, and wondered if anyone else was seeing the same thing I was.
I thought she was another refugee, but that was not one of the poems that most spoke to me. And, you know, translation seems to be death in this one, so.
Yeah, well, he's talking about foreigners, the poem being a foreign body of a foreigner. So we know the poem would be foreign. And I just didn't know where suddenly the woman was coming.
I think he's leaving those two, you know, the thought of the poem in translation and this thought of refugees in a boat where there's I think violence toward them. They're being thrown overboard or something.
Yeah. Because we inflict our own thoughts onto the poem and our own words. And sometimes they're not nearly as good as the original.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a political message in this poem too, though.
Yeah, I think there's it's kind of the mixture of starting out with this extended metaphor, this artifice, if you will, And then there's the world, which is actually full of real things. In fact, he plays around with that at a different point later in the book, I think, where the thing that is real almost becomes unreal, or the thing that is unreal becomes real. But okay, so translating a poem is like this, but then it is a world in which there are refugees, there are people who die in open waters and cling to boats, and then the oil rigs there, and there's a lot of stuff about economy in the book, and empire, and all that kind of stuff. And so clinging to the oil rig, I don't know, it seemed like a really interesting blending of those two, the kind of fictions we create, or the artifices we create, and then the realities, which are very often impinging upon those. And something, or maybe someone like her, someone should translate her. I mean, someone, maybe this is actually real, but how do we get this into our poem? How do we get this into our minds? How do we wrap our mind? How do we find a language that will hold this reality, which is so horrible?
Yeah.
I like the way he was playing with the metaphor when he went from page 35 to 36 and flipped it. 120 foreigners and a leaking boat is too many, so the ocean fills with poems. It's simply the reverse of a poem in translation is like the dead body of a foreigner washed up on our shores. And so then he takes the bodies of the foreigners and turns them into poems. There was also, I can't remember who did it. I think Stevie Smith, maybe, a poem that ends not waving but drowning. I can't remember the rest of it, but that kept coming to mind as I was reading this too. And the translator of the Roman poem is really in the parts that are quoted, paralleling the American empire. It's this imperialistic thing that he talks of as bringing multicultural people into the Roman fold. He talks about the Roman tendency to absorb and therefore transform foreign cultures, their gods and foods. And then he flips it back to what feels almost like a real world. Outside the auditorium, it had grown dark, a perfect summer night. The 1,000 vessels on the great black ocean glittered and loomed. And you can't, if you're a classicist, you can't read that without thinking about the face that launched the 1,000 ships.
Ships, right.
And yet he brings you back again and again to what happens to individual human beings and how they're not treated like human beings. Now the American workers zippered them into vinyl bags, and you think about the animals being zipped into vinyl bags, and that zipping into bags and getting rid of things seems to come up several times. Which in the translator's metaphor constitutes a kind of publication. This is a man with a sense of humor. It's an odd sense of humor.
I have a lineation question. 56, 57, there's a poem, Rain. I liked that poem a lot. It was more concrete than some of them. I liked the fact that we weren't trying to figure out the cognitive revolution in the middle of it, and that it kind of followed itself along. It's double or triple spaced, whereas something like archaeology would look quite similar, except that it is single spaced. What do you reckon he gets out of that wide spacing in a poem like Rain?
He made me pause. He made me do a hard pause after the end of every line. Normally, if I saw a line that was jammed, like the second one going into the third, I might hesitate slightly, but I'd smooth it into one thought. And because he's made that space, I don't do that. I break each line separately.
I wouldn't have said that was especially enjammed. We've got an independent clause, and the next one is connected by the coordinating conjunction. I would have said that was mildly instopped, mist descended over the evening rooftops. It's more enjammed, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, half from 5 into 6. But by and large, he's stopping pretty hard on most of these.
Yeah.
Well, that was what the space did for me.
Yeah.
It made me hold each line as a discrete image or a discrete set of images.
Yeah, I wonder, I mean, there's repetition and variation that we all play around with. And so you can repeat a structure of a poem. And as we talked about, the first 2 poems look visually the same, and then archaeology comes along, it's different. Even poems like the newspapers and the vast economies, there for a little while, you've got a little bit more of couplets or maybe a single line occasionally, but to me, it breaks up just as instead of thinking about the individual poem, I may think about it in concert with all the ones before and after. And maybe it just offers some sense of variety and a different kind of pause. I don't know what the thinking is necessarily, but at least that may be the effect. I liked there's so many poems here that I have made notes on, but the vast economies and the newspapers, especially the newspapers, I thought was a fascinating poem. The news as something, I don't know, incomplete. It always seems that way in his work, and maybe one's own life too, lacking a sense of perspective. I think he uses that word at least once or twice in the book, perspective. I love the metaphor of the museum brain.
Yeah.
And the museum as a place, a repository, a kind of I don't know, a place of explanation, where we could objectify and maybe see how the mind works. And I think for him too, that whatever that mind is, here it is in that museum, but if we step out of this poem also, we can think about the individual mind. And it is, I forget who said it, that you don't really think of a lot of autobiography or confessional. I mean, there may be some of that here, but it doesn't feel like a lot of confessional poets. And so the individual mind, it's hard to say that it's Kevin Prufer's, but there is an individual mind at work in these poems, but there's a family mind, there's a collective or a societal mind. There are ideas that segments in our society buy into, whether that's about something political. So there are all these, there's this mind. And I just think that's such a wonderful moment in that poem. I was, I'm always occasionally envious when I read any poet, but there are lots of moments in his book that are enviable.
Yeah.
And I love too that even in that poem, is that the one where the mother removes the stain?
Yeah.
Yeah, on page 54, she'd clean the stain away. And I got to thinking about that and in the ways that word resonates through the book, and which ideas are stains, or what fictions maybe stains on our mind. Some of them we maybe can't clean away.
And that particular poem is more confessional or more personal than a lot of the other ones. And the fiction seems to be the wondering what about the photograph of the newspaper of his father, and wondering what that was all about, and creating something maybe in his mind, what had become of the gun. That poem was different than a lot of the other poems for me. And I like that poem.
I wondered too if Wet Leaves was real. That's the one where the cat is very old.
Oh,
The guy
yeah, and he had to gas it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But what he remembers with those wet leaves, the leaves go all the way through it in a very lyrical way.
Yeah.
And then you come back to Tommy hiding under those leaves and scared, and finally jumping out and saying, "Here I am." And it just felt like something.
Which has an echo of the other poem.
Mm-hmm.
Here, the woman lost at sea, clinging to the oil rig. Here I am.
Yeah.
You know what? In the Wet Leaves poem, on my first reading of it, I thought, oh, this is going to lead to death of everybody in the house because it's going to get drunk or pass out or something, and then the car is running in the garage, and there'd be. I thought that's where the poem was going, but it didn't. I don't know if anybody else had that thought, but it seemed almost inevitable. Like, I guess by this time when I'm reading his work, I'm thinking, hey, yeah, that's what's going to happen. There's something else I don't know. One thing I noticed is that there are lots of like space, like he plays around with space. There's a zoo or cages, auditorium. I'm probably leaving out some. I don't know, but I was thinking, and also maybe the fictions that we somehow get trapped in. There's the theater, on page 28, all of humanity catching its breath in the enormous theater. I love that line. But these spaces, and bounded, maybe I should say bounded spaces like auditoriums, theater, cage, zoo, even the garage in the Wet Leaves poem. And of course there are more expansive spaces, like the ocean, or the basement in archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and then the cover of the book is space light.
It is, but it's so strange. You've got these action figures floating through space, and they're just blurred enough that you can't tell what they are. I kind of thought for a minute that maybe the orange one might be He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, but I can't really tell.
Well, one thing, the Into the Weeds poem on page 61, later on in that poem on page 63, it talks about the neat row of Star Wars action figures.
Mhm.
And I thought, is that I don't know if that's a Star Wars action figure or not. But
Huh.
the title of that cover art is Untitled from the series Space. So he's doing something with that.
Maybe that's something we can just ask him.
Yeah.
I mean, admittedly, I always feel stupid when I can't figure this stuff out, but sometimes when I hear the answer, I'm like, yeah, I wasn't gonna figure that one out. I did not have the information I needed.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
this cover is, to me, is not an appealing cover. Like that, if I was just going to pick a book to read, it wouldn't, and based on the cover, it would not be this one.
I wonder how much autonomy Four-Way gives.
Yeah, I was thinking in
I was
that
curious about that.
Into the Weeds. I was trying to figure out each section. You know, there are 4 sections, and so what does each one kind of do? Maybe Helga, you know, that 4th section has a little bit more of a political.
It does, and it deals with death
It's violent.
quite a bit, and also crime, like on 61. That poem, Into the Weeds,
Into the
I'm
Weeds.
sorry. He begins with the brutality of these 2 men. Yeah. But what I wanted to say about that first sentence in that poem, I really had to admire how he structured it. It's that whole paragraph is 1 sentence, and how he broke it off to really not make it feel like we're going to get lost in it. So I was very impressed with that. But yes, most of those poems, I think they have some kind of death in them.
Yeah, earlier, Helga, when you were talking about his lineage, this was the what I was trying to find. It was that particular opening stanza.
Okay.
Because of the delayed, the way in which the syntax delays that key information about, well, the brutality of those 2 men who broke into her apartment. Okay, so we're thinking real.
Yes.
And murdered her boyfriend. Then, as she stepped from the shower, shot her too, right in the face. And so, you know, each of those lines as a unit of attention seems to work very well. So she crumbled over the bathtub, little blood leaking from her mouth onto the white tiles, has stayed with me, though it was something I saw in a film class years ago and was fictional.
It's fictional.
I was
Wow.
like, oh, whoa, that's really good. So, you know, he provides us with a scene that, you know, I think because of the poems that have preceded it, right? You know, we believe it to be real. And then it turns out to be fictional, and it's this reality that's delivered to us by this particular syntax. But it also got me thinking about how, I don't know, while the unreal passes for real, the real in Prufer's poems is often unreal, unbelievable, unfathomable. We can't translate it. We can't contain it. We can't make sense of it. You know, what is the, you know, what it means the following. But
and in that particular poem, he's using that film, that fictional death to set us up for the real death that occurs later on in that one, his friend,
Hmm.
Yeah.
which makes that actual personal death feel differently than
Feel
if
different.
it started with that.
Hmm.
At
And
the end of
I
that
love,
poem, where the fictional and the dead become over time similar,
yeah,
which is a very
Oh.
interesting line.
I loved what he said on page 65. For the dead, death is the entire truth.
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
thought that is
what else
right.
could there be?
Yeah.
Oh, real close to there on page 69 in the poem in small spaces. Maybe that's what got me thinking about spaces, but in each of the stanzas as he breaks them apart, like you're talking about, Sandy, sometimes the stanza where you think, okay, that's the end of it. No, it actually continues, but there's still the plus sign.
Yeah.
There's still, but each of those becomes a kind of space unto itself. But maybe one way to think about that is, and maybe a way to think about the juxtaposition, as he moves from page 68 to 69, he says, but she burned that letter in the sink and all the others unopened, having moved on with her life, having taken a job in a new city, married a good man. And anyway, that's one way into this story. And it seems like he starts with something, a premise, and he goes so far into it, and there's another way into it. There's, whether it's metaphor or the juxtaposition of a different story or different narrative line, but it becomes another way into this
Yeah.
complexity.
And going on down page 69, I love how the bottle of vodka talks to him, and then his empty glass, and then the bottle telling him, have another one, have another one.
I'm hoping
That's
this poem is a total fiction.
Yes.
It's not. I found an interview where he talks about it.
Oh, it's true? Really? The guy
Oh,
wrote
I always like to go
himself?
see what they say in the interviews, and he said he saw such a documentary where that had happened.
Oh, that's so hard.
Moreover, interestingly enough, he says that he thinks he remembers that the guy eventually killed the woman he was stalking, and he didn't put that in the poem.
Oh my goodness.
Because what he thought was interesting was that this creeper coming through the rafters is like what we say about God, that it's
Right.
unseen and it moves from one realm to another without any
Watches over us.
and it
Watches
has these
over us,
mysterious impulses, and it's basically violent.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a mighty poem.
It's very interesting thought. Yes.
But if he's going to go that far, wouldn't you think he'd go on and say, and by the way, maybe God's getting ready to kill you? Maybe that's the basic fact of human existence. I mean, we all die.
So we do.
But he decides to leave that out. And apparently God is very gendered.
Yes.
Because then that leaves people like me hoping that it is a real fiction and not.
A true lie.
Helga, when you were talking about the bottle and the vodka, it's speaking, it reminded me, he does have a lot of, he gives agency and voice to, the drone and to leopards and
Exactly.
even the pig trough. Remember that? The pig trough even speaks.
Yeah.
That seems to be a kind of a move in his poems that he does in multiple places throughout the book.
That's true. He seems to give everything anthropomorphic qualities, which is wonderful, I think. I love that very much in his poems.
Well, especially in the drone poem. Is it the blueberry poem
Very-
with the parakeet? Yeah, I mean the fact that the drone is somehow
That's weird.
speaking, and I don't know, it makes it even creepier. I mean, the whole idea of a drone is a bizarre. Talk about a god, like smiting somebody. But it's a very creepy thing in and of itself. And now in Prufer's poem, it speaks.
Yeah.
In that one, I kind of wanted to know what the bird died of. Was it the child's handling, or was it something more large scale, or what? It says the bird would survive a week.
Well,
I
I mean,
thought it was the girl.
yeah, you thought what, Sandy?
I thought it was the girl being too
So
rough
too.
with it.
I kept thinking it was going to be the drone.
The
Yeah,
reason I thought it was the girl was because the drone kept Love kept coming up with the drone, and Love kept coming up with the bird and the girl.
I expect you are right. Those two things are being very, very tightly connected. Things which handle things and don't let them rest.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
This is definitely one of those books where there's an attraction and a revulsion all at the same time.
Yeah, I want you to tell him that.
Oh.
Well, there are these dichotomies. I mean, you've already talked. I mean, you've mentioned there's the humane and the inhumane. There's the real and the unreal, and I mean, we could probably think through several of these dichotomies that exist. That we talked about the brutality, but is there some tenderness as well? I know there's the brutality, but there's also cruelty. Another part of that. I mean, that's the title of one of the poems, I believe.
Yeah.
Cruelties. Oh yeah, page 73.
Yeah.
Is that the one that ends with the? Oh yeah, the garden is perfect. This is a perfect garden. Almost like an Eden, like a.
Yeah.
Cruelties. That's the one where we killed the wasp.
Yeah.
We killed
And the
the
people,
castaways.
And he's glad that his cruelties are smaller. Only, of course, by the time you're finished, they're not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We killed the fire ants.
Well, is it cruelty against the natural world, and there's cruelty against the human world, and there's cruelty against the garden.
Well, I think he is eroding those distinctions pretty hard. The wasps can suffer, and that is sufficient.
Yeah.
It's still this kind of thoughtless, ruthless, murder of things we don't think of as human.
Yeah.
Oh, Catherine, I hadn't thought about this, but that follows the poem we were talking about the man in the rafters, or what people say about God, and then we move from that directly into cruelties. A young man who becomes a kind of. I mean, when we do these things, we are playing the role of God, I guess, right? And we're stamping out something.
Yeah. And the garden is perfect. This is a perfect garden. Kind of makes me think of the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it's really. Is that satire? is that one satire, Alice?
That's satire.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think so.
and the way in which economy, the economics, is that part of the cruelty?
It is.
You know. Oh, I actually have a little Instagram account called Best Words in the Best Order, you know, and I sometimes will, screenshot a book and then, have a little quote from it. I didn't do this one, but I thought of it when I read it on page 93. The problem with dogma is it wants to make of complex problems simple solutions, which I like those lines. Actually, I did one of his one time. I don't know if I can find it really quickly, but I think it's from the book Churches. Because he had a really fascinating little statement. Oh yeah, he says, no, it's from In a Beautiful Country. And church bells, sometimes they say America, and sometimes they say Jesus. It's hard to tell.
Indeed.
I thought those are and that's from a lot of years ago. That's from In a Beautiful Country. I think that book came out in 11. Yeah, 2011.
Speaking of Jesus, didn't you love Jesus Christ? That was such a fine use of anecdote.
Page 28.
28.
Mm-hmm. It's the one where you start out with the scene that's in the play. And
oh yeah.
That feels like where you are. That feels like what's happening. And then all of a sudden he shifts it. And no, you've got the cell phone going off. It's the play that's being interrupted.
Yeah.
And then, the cell phone going off at Father's funeral.
Right.
Pulls it all back in memory.
Well, that's another little thread through the book is, things about technology, the way technology invades our lives. There's another invasion.
But also he uses memory a lot.
Yep.
And how fragmentary memories are, and how they come back prompted by small stimuli, whether it's wet leaves or whether it's a cell phone ringing, and ringing and ringing. But those little things that are memory threads seem to be woven over and over through his work in the same way that they're woven through our minds, through our lives.
I'm about to admit him.
Oh dear. Okay.
Keep talking, Alice.
Nope.
There's the book.
All right.
There he is. Hi, Kevin.
Hi.
Hey, Kevin.
Hey. Hey, there you are, Jeff, in your little poster square.
We're glad we're able to join us, and again, obviously, thanks for sitting down and writing poems.
We're reading the book.
Yeah, very, very fascinating. We usually have more people here. I don't know, it's probably the beginning of the semester kind of thing, but I forget how many people are in our group now, Sandy, 20 something. I don't know.
We have actually 80 on the list.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They don't all show up.
Yeah. So if you see a huge spike in your book sales here.
I'll remember that.
Will anybody want to ask a question? Or Alice, you were talking about the poem Jesus Christ and the cell phone ringing and stuff.
Yeah. What seemed to me to happen a lot with your poems is that there's some trigger that's a memory trigger, and you use those memory triggers the same way that they feel like they come up in real life. So it was the cell phone, Jesus Christ, where it happening once brings up when it happened before. Wet leaves, where the leaves themselves become the motif that takes you back to Tommy. Is this deliberate?
Yeah.
Am I making it up? Oh, I make up a lot of things, you know.
No, that, I mean, I'm just thinking about it because I haven't thought about it in exactly those terms before, but yeah, it's definitely deliberate. I think I'm interested in two things in the poems, and one of them, when we're talking about memory, is sort of this idea that a free verse poem might be the recreation on paper of the movements of a complicated mind at work on an unsolvable problem. And you know, it's one of the things that has attracted me to poetry, because I think what poetry has that other genres, written genres, do not have is it has access to all kinds of silences, different kinds of silences and qualities of silences that prose doesn't have access to. And when I combine this sort of interest in silences with an interest in the recreation of a mind, or the performance of a mind at work on an unsolvable problem, what I'm allowed to do with those silences is to sort of, well, a lot of things, but one of them is to sort of create this sense of unarticulated thought that we all experience in our lives, but you can't easily stick in a novel, right? You know, those moments where, you know, where you're thinking about without words before the words come, and the silences of, say, a stanza break or a line break or a midline pause, like a caesura, allow for that. But they also, those silences also can be bridged by two different kinds of memories, which I think is what you're seeing. That is, there's the memory of the cell phone mixed up with all kinds of silences as the mind at work on the unsolvable problem, you know. In that case, it's ultimately figuring out the death of somebody that he went to the theater with. I'm suddenly inarticulate because literally a car just crashed into a post right outside my window right there. So looks like they're okay though. Anyway, back to silences. Yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing. The thing I'm very interested in writing is narrative, and how minds sort of recreate narrative through memory, and how we sort of organize, you know, events that are probably unrelated to each other into cohesive visions of the world. And in that case, of course, they're the case of that they're two very unrelated events, except that they happen to be cell phones that rang. They otherwise have really nothing to do with each other, and none of the actors are the same, and nobody making the calls is the same. But I'm interested in the mind that tries to bring those two things together, and through them, through the lens that they create, that mind creates, using the lens to try to view a problem anew. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very nice. Yeah, we had talked about that image of the museum mind, which was really kind of wonderful. And I've talked a little bit about the sense of juxtaposition, or what I think of as juxtaposition, that goes on in your work. And maybe what you're talking about is one way of getting at that, but starting with some problem, starting with some premise, and then a car crashes outside your window, and suddenly that's in the poem. It doesn't seem related, but it's now. And I think there's one of your poems, kind of early on, The Damned, on page 18, 19, and 20, 21, where on the very last page on 21, you talk about being so involved are we with the details of our lives. We who have rebuilt our city under a new administration. And I stopped right there, and I remember I made a note to myself where I was thinking about how I think in your mind, if I can make some comment like that, there's from stanza to stanza or from thread to thread, there's always a new administration and all the kind of implications of that word. There's a new politics, there's a new focus, there's a new agenda of what we should be surveying or paying attention to or reconsidering. What does this mean? And every new stanza, you start in one direction and then the next one maybe comes, out of left field seemingly, except it is connected eventually.
Yeah.
And there's a kind of juggling is not the right word, but a kind of disparity that is introduced, but then somehow accounted for.
Yeah, I think what's going on there, I like this idea that I'm terrible talking about my own work, just so you know, I get all weird. But I like this idea that, whenever we're engaging with somebody in the real world and they're telling us a story, we're always silently judging, to what extent we believe this or to what extent we believe that, right? So if I say like, oh man, I went out to the bar last night and I had like 40 beers and and the women were all over me, man. You're probably thinking, you know what? No, I think he went out to the bar last night and had like 6 beers and no one was all, we're always sort of, that's an extreme case, but even in the most mild cases, like when I said that a car just crashed into a post out there, maybe you thought, well, maybe it just glanced the post or something. So I'm kind of interested in,
or maybe you just made that up for dramatic effect.
Maybe I did, but I didn't. But they didn't crash too badly because they've moved on now. But I think one of the exercises of this book in particular, and one of the reasons I was called it the art of fiction, was I think often in literature, when we're listening to somebody tell a story in literature, one of the tricks that the writer does is he puts us in the position of both sort of understanding what the words are telling us and also understanding what we think might in fact be true, and that those are two different things, and that we're often asked, that art of like reading, for instance, like Story by Edgar Allan Poe is bridging that gap, right? I'm using Edgar Allan Poe as an extreme case when his character says at the beginning of The Black Cat, I must tell you first of all at the very onset here at the start of my story that I am not crazy. You're immediately saying, oh, no, you're crazy. And, but then the delight of the story is sort of understanding what is it that he says and what is it that we believe. And the sort of the literature lies in the force field created between what is said and what we believe. And I got really interested in that in this story, in this book, and people telling stories. Like when he says that we were so involved with the new administration, my hope was that, you'd sort of be like, wait, what? That's not true, but there's a truth that's happening between what he's saying and what you're knowing to be fact. So yeah, it's I started out as a fiction writer, and I probably read a lot more fiction than poetry, and I just love those qualities that are available to fiction writers and poets of communicating both story and creating doubt or disbelief, and then what the silences available to poetry allow us to sort of make it so that it's the mind thinking that's doing the communication and not the person saying, well, let me tell you a story. That there's some element of interiority as well as untrustworthiness, or where you're asking yourself, is this person in this poem lying to me or to himself? Like, who's being lied to, in fact? I just love that kind of stuff. And living through the Trump administration when I wrote most of this, of course, that felt like a really central question, in our public spaces. Are they lying to me or are they just lying to themselves? I often couldn't tell.
I particularly enjoyed the way you well, I don't know if enjoyed's the right word. I'm afraid I came into this. I had only gotten your book from the publisher, so that I've only read it once. Came in yesterday. But it seemed to me that a lot of what you were writing was satire, and a lot of what you were writing made the reader think about parallels, and also made the reader take what seemed metaphor and watch it turn.
Mhm.
Oh,
Yeah, I like that word satire as in something that's supposed to sort of both make fun of and also maybe in whatever tiny way a poem can do anything like this, sort of also make the world a little bit better. I was driving down the road here in Houston, Texas, where I live, and I can't stand our politics, but I was driving down the road and I was listening to National Public Radio, and they were talking about it was just a report on the wild hog problem in Houston. It's a big problem all over Texas, and it was a fairly even-handed report. Just talking about ways farmers are handling it and this kind of poison hog kaput. But the more they spoke, the more I realized that the rhetoric they were using was really identical to the rhetoric of the way we were talking about immigration in this country. Like there were just a lot of even overlap about alien species of hogs coming in and taking over our American farmers, whatever. It was creepy. But I think it's hard not to look at a situation like that, which is utterly absurd, to be hearing about hog kaput, the new poison on the hog market, which is a real thing, and thinking that this sounds like the way our elected officials are talking about immigration policy. It's such an inherently absurd thing that I think satire is the only way you can approach it. I mean, at least without,
Well, but again, to me, it's a kind of juxtaposition that is so jarring, kind of like, it was that poem, Not Thinking, I believe, where the woman's thoughts are, she's shot by the spy or whatever, and her thoughts go over, all over the window in blood, right? And then the very next thing is a commercial for breath mints, as if these things are like, normal. And the thing is they are.
they totally are.
They're absolutely, I mean, they happen, they're normal to our world, but we don't even need a museum mind. We don't need a museum brain to go, wait a minute. This doesn't follow this.
Well, or in the mind of the speaker who's kind of refusing to allow for the fact in that poem that that the woman's head getting spattered all over the windshield is there particularly to sell him breath mints. Like,
yeah,
that's why that woman's head spattered all over the window exists at all as an image, is to sell him some breath mints. I mean, that's pretty crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, which is the fiction.
Yeah, no, they're all fiction. They're both fiction.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like watching where these shows on home repair shows. It's like, that's not a show you're watching. That's a commercial for Lowe's. Chip and Joanna Gaines. That's not a show. That whole thing is a commercial for Lowe's or Home Depot or whoever.
Well, one thing, Kevin, I'm interested in is the structure of the poems on the page. And I know you're talking about the silences that we can create in poetry. And looking at the different, like the art of fiction has the little plus signs, and a lot of the poems do, and with very uneven lines. And then archaeology seems single spaced, kind of a block of lines. And then rain, we discussed this, rain, looking double spaced.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering about the choices, especially in rain. Like, why did you decide that? Because we really liked that poem and we were curious about that particular choice.
Sure. That's so funny that you picked the spacing, because that's my one argument with the publisher of this book, is I had really wanted that to be like space and a half, and they made it 2, and I wrote to her at the last minute, it's like, "Could you just make it space and a half, please?" And she didn't do it. I should say she. It's the whole crowd. But I have this idea that well, there are a couple of answers there. One of them is I sort of made up for myself this sort of notion about what kinds of stanzas can do what kinds of work or carry what kinds of baggage. Like I thought that, for instance, it's very hard to write a narrative poem in couplets, because the couplets seem to be inherently meditative. That is, there's sort of a closed circuit. Line 1 is a call and line 2 is a response, often. I mean, I'm not speaking like always, it's just how they seem to work. You know, so couplets seem like little miniature circuits that go around and around from top to bottom. So they don't really build stories very well. I always sort of used to think to myself that narrative begins often with quatrains. You know, it's there that you have enough room to sort of create a narrative and then have that pause after the stanza where the person's sort of thinking, well, then what happened? And then the words come and the next quatrain arrives. But the single line stanza, the stanza of one line, often seem to me to be sort of intensely meditative. That is, it's a sort of a blurt without even a response, you know? Another little blurt, like a little bit like looking through somebody's photo album, you know, and every line is another picture. And I for this poem, I was very interested in that person in the poem who's looking out the window and seeing this happen. And I was trying to create a sort of meditative space for that person where maybe for the reader, there's some conclusion. For him, it's just the acknowledgement of glittering cylinders of power. But in the other poems that are more like with the plus signs, I've been doing this my whole career, these little plus signs, even when my old publisher wouldn't let me put them in and insisted on some house style. I would always turn them into plus signs. Kind of this idea that these narrative poems, every section was sort of in addition to the previous section.
Yeah.
That there'd be an imaginary equal sign at the end of the poem, where like the poem is sort of saying like, well, what was that all about? Is the equals. But it made me, think about, when I was thinking about silence, I know I'm talking about silences a lot, but that, the one silence, when I'm doing this plus signs, the one sort of silence I'm aiming for is the silence after the last word of the poem. You know what I mean? Like after the imaginary equal sign, that seems like the really interesting silence, because it's a silence that's, offered to the reader instead of sort of performed as a kind of a moment of interior silence of the speaker. And I used to do this thing where I draw arrows at the ends of every line of poetry to ask myself, like, so what are we moving towards after every line? Or, why is this line stopping here? Like, is it the next word is hard for the speaker to say? Or is it the next word is something the speaker doesn't know to say? Or has he not decided what that next word is? And that's what I was always sort of arrowing towards.
Yeah.
So speaking of publishers, how about that cover?
It's weird, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't know. I had a different cover. We had a different cover all designed. It looked really crazy. It was good. It was a weird cover of a bunch of animals underneath a treehouse looking up at it in the nighttime with a fire going. And right when they were about to go to press, another book came out from Alice James Books with the exact same image on the cover.
Oh,
Wow.
So we had no time, and they picked this one out. And at first I hated it, but now I kind of like it. I think it's weird. I have one friend who absolutely hates it. And every time this book comes up, he says, your book with a terrible cover. But
What can you say?
Are those your Star Wars figurines?
no, there's some photographer. His name was on the back, David Leventhal. He did a whole series of weird, blurry photographs of action figures.
I don't know if you probably have thought about this, Kevin, but the 4 sections,
Mm-hmm.
is there a particular kind of movement you were thinking of, or how those were operating and distinctively unto themselves, and then how they how they move through the book?
You know, I'm really bad at organizing a book. I usually don't know what I'm doing. I once handed in a book that was 3 sections long, and then by the time I finished working with my editor on it, it was 18 sections long, and each section had only 3 poems in it. I'm sure I had a plan, but you know, it's a weird situation putting a book together. I don't know how many people have done that. Maybe everybody, I don't know. But
Terrible.
it's a little bit weird because you're creating something as a work of art that's supposed to be by itself. Like nobody's writing a poem saying, I want this to be on page 24 between these 2 other poems, unless that person's crazy. So you're writing this sort of individual thing that is not supposed to live with other things. Oh yeah, that's the one.
Is that the one?
Mm-hmm. And then what your publisher's asking you to do is sort of put them together so there's some arc. So there's like some larger vision happening. It always reminded me, like if you went into an art museum and you said, wow, this is a really great gallery with 30 great paintings in it that I really like a lot. But you know what'd be really great is if we stitch them all together into one big quilt. And then that would be the ultimate. I mean, it just seems like an unnatural thing to do with the poems. I don't know how to answer the question because I know I started with the art of fiction because I wanted to lay out terms of what fiction, how fiction was going to be used here. Like it wasn't a guidebook about how to write a short story, but it was going to be a book that was thinking about the power of telling stories or the power of fictions that exist only because we all believe in them, like money.
Yeah, you use the word economy or economies more than one time, and you know, you do move from the art of fiction to an American tale.
Oh yeah, that's true. I remember that too.
Yeah, so and I think those are kind of wonderful brackets for the entire book. But I think, well, I mean, you know, when we meet for these discussions, we read through and thought, but it's not a graduate workshop. We're not trying to like, you know, wrap our minds around every little thing. But I felt as I was reading this that every section was something that I could, if I gave myself enough time, to really think about how, okay, here's how these poems fit together. And there's a kind of wonderful beginning, middle, and end, even in section 1. And we talked about section 4, had a little bit more of, I mean, not that they all have a political current, you know, which we picked up on, but especially the last section has that political election night, faraway wars.
I voted.
I have voted. Yeah. So we knew that that's at least one way to cinch that section together.
I was trying to do this thing where I do. I mean, I don't mean to make it sound like they're random at all. They're definitely not. I mean, I sort of sort them into piles. And you're right. I certainly thought of that last section. I didn't want to come off as really politically strident at the beginning.
Sure.
So I kind of worked my way up to being politically strident. But I also think about my editor, Sally Ball, likes to say, you know, that every section of a book should have one sort of poem that really that feels like the touchstone poem. So I know I often think about that too, and that's the sort of thematic poem that everything else works around. Like An American Tale is the sort of touchstone poem of section 4, and The Art of Fiction definitely of section 1. And then you know, hopefully the rest isn't filler, but it, you know, like there's, you know, when there's like a loudest voice in the room, like there's always a loudest voice in the room in each section.
Yeah.
Well, but the thing about reading a book though is that what each reader thinks of as that loudest voice can shift quite kind of easily. I mean, if I thought about the poem Archaeology, which I did a great deal, you know, I see it as a kind of, you know, sifting through, studying the meaning of kind of, you know, I think I talked about sort of the archaeology of America, the archaeology of American. Is America a fiction? Is America a virus? Is America? What are the ideas that are so central to us? I mean, immigration has always been one of them. You know, we've been very open at times, and we've been very closed at times. So, you know, that what's in the basement, you know, and how many bodies are there? You know, I mean, so that, you know, that poem, you didn't begin the book with it, but if it were the loudest voice in that particular stanza, the ramifications of it are really fascinating.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't like that. When I wrote the poem, I didn't think it worked at all. I really didn't, and I thought it didn't work because it was the only poem in this book that's actually based on any kind of truth. We really did have a floor-to-ceiling shelf full of skulls in my basement when I was growing up, and you know, I'd go down there, and there really was one with a tomahawk. I don't know what created the whole, but in my little child's brain, it was the tomahawk, of course, you know. And it was because my dad did his lab work in the basement. He was an archaeologist, and you know, that was the 70s. I mean, you couldn't do that now, obviously. It was probably the wrong thing to do then, but I thought that poem didn't work because it felt like just telling something about my own life, which I'm really reluctant to do in a poem. I just, but it's one of those ones where you know, I sent it to a little magazine, a really little magazine, because they asked for some poems, and I was kind of like, well, I don't want to send them my ones that I really love because nobody's ever going to read them. It's so small. So I sent them that, and then I went back and thought it did feel important. Like, I don't know why I was so allergic to this idea that if it's actually true, then it can't be that interesting. But there you go.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of the opposite of how a lot of my students think about poems. You know, a lot of my students think it's interesting because it's true. Yeah. I just have always assumed the opposite.
Have no art of fiction.
Huh?
The students who think that the truer the better, they have no art of fiction.
Maybe not. I mean, they write good poems. You know, I think you can write really good poems and, you know, be telling true stories. I mean, it's true stories as far as you see them to be true, but I don't know. I think I wrote a book a long time ago, my first book, which I wrote in my 20s, early 20s. And it's a pretty bad book. And I think it's pretty bad because I had sort of bought this idea in school, you know, probably because of reading a lot of the confessional poets or something, that a poem ought to be true, that there's something about putting line breaks into a thing that makes it move from you can make shit up to this, now we have to be telling the truth here because the lines are shorter. I don't even understand what I had in my mind. And that book got one review, and the review said, Prufer knows nothing about anything that has happened in poetry for the last millennium. He has clearly never left the state of Missouri. And I just think, so then I just kind of thought about it and just decided that for the next book, I was just going to make it all up. It was just going to be, I was just going to make up stories. And I found it so freeing in a way, you know, like the idea that maybe like the world of the not me is way bigger than the world that's my own experience. And it just, it's very exciting to suddenly say, well, I can just tell a story about, I don't care, you know, some guy who takes his wife on a date after having just cleaned up the dead hogs.
Not the hogs.
Anybody else have a comment or question? We usually just keep people about 30 minutes or so, Kevin, but
We'd love for you to read a poem if you'd like.
Sure. Anyone in particular?
Any requests?
Right.
Huh?
Well, if nobody else is going to ask, I'll ask for Wet Leaves.
Oh, sure. That's kind of fun because when the coronavirus happened, right? I had a bunch of readings, you know, all set up to go, you know what I mean? And every single one of them canceled. So then what happened was there's this publicist, what page is it on? 75. There's this publicist at Four Way Books who's really good. but she immediately sort of scheduled, I'm not kidding, like 30 Zoom readings or something like that. Like maybe 25, I can't remember. There were just so many Zoom readings because suddenly you could be anywhere, you know what I mean? And I got so sick of reading poems from this book because, you know, you just like reading like art of fiction for the 30th time. But I never ever read Wet Leaves because I never thought it would perform very well. So this is the first time I've ever read.
All right.
It's just so gross, you know what I mean? I just thought, so I'd never read it. So I'll read it. That sounds great. Wet Leaves. But by Sunday, the old cat had slipped into a torpor and would not move from the sofa, though the children stroked her and spoke to her softly and gave her bits of ham, which she only wheezed at. That's how he knew it was time to put her down. What else could he do? Outside, the leaves fell, ticketing the cars parked along the avenue. Sweet hum of flies over a decayed mass of leaves. How he'd once loved autumn. The smell of distant burning, the neighborhood suffused. The cat turned her green eyes upward toward the lamp-like faces of the children bending over her. If only she could move her legs, if only she could float across the room and up the stairs as she'd done 1,000 times before into the linen closet. Though it was Sunday and the vet closed the next day too, a rainy Christmas, it seemed a cruelty to prolong the cat's suffering until Tuesday. He could barely stand the gasping at night. It sounded human. The way his older brother fought for air nights in the bunk above him, that deep whistling, even in sleep. His brother never could breathe. Finally, he'd die of that. As sometimes a falling leaf stuck to the wet window pane, and then another, leaves gathering on the sill in the light rain late in the year. Such oak trees, he'd thought years ago, when first he saw the house he now shared with his 2 daughters and a dying cat. When the girls went to sleep at last, he took the cat to the garage and set her in the corner wrapped in a blanket. For a while, she closed her eyes and seemed to sleep, and he was glad of that. He'd made such a leaf pile, all the leaves from the yard, and then he'd raked leaves from other yards onto a tarp and dragged those over too, and all the boys leaped into them, and even his older brother came out and jumped in too. The smell of rain and leaf rot. It's the best solution, he told himself, as he turned the engine on and let the car idle in the closed garage. Then, in the living room, he poured himself a drink. It was the most humane way. What else could he do? And another drink. Shoot her in the head? As the room grew small. Tommy, he'd said into the evening. Tommy? But Tommy didn't answer, and the leaf pile loomed in the moonlight, larger now than it seemed before, and cool and deep. He was almost crying because he was alone, their parents out for dinner and Tommy in charge, and it was late, the leaves shifting in the wind. They shifted again. The car idling in the garage. How long would it take? The sound of ice melting in his glass. How he loved his daughters upstairs. And then there was Tommy at last, rising from the leaf pile, laughing. Scared you, he said. Scared you. Leaves in his hair, on his sweater. And what could he do but pretend? No, I was just wondering where you were. And Tommy laughing. You thought I was dead. So an hour later, when he opened the garage, the cat wasn't on her blanket. And it took him several minutes to find her carcass squeezed in the corner behind the rakes. Wow, that's weird to read that. Thank you all for reading the book. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed it.
We did enjoy it. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for
We
joining us.
did. Thank you.
Anytime.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll talk to you later.
Okay, take care.
That was great.
Yeah, oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
I was thinking, as you read that, I was thinking about the way he mentioned that there are the lines about shifting. And that's, the stanzas do that. They just shift. They shift in some way, interesting way. And meaning keeps shifting. Oh, I've got a hold of it. No, you don't. It keeps shifting.
Yeah. That
I know
long-
exactly what America is. No, it keeps shifting. So-
Hmm.
Very nice.
Okay.
Okay, next month, we're having this book.
Mhm.
Are Always Hungry. And I do not know how to pronounce her name. Ji Young, does anybody know? Ji Young.
Yeah. Well, all right.
And then let's see, that's September, and then October is Carolyn Forche.
Yes.
Mhm. I think so.
She said that she on something I've commented on, she said she would come. So I'll have to contact her and put that on her date if she will, if she still can.
And
Right.
so September will be on the 21st.
Okay.
September 21st.
All right,
Okay.
good. Well, thanks everybody.
Yeah,
Thank you very
This was
much.
really
Thank
delightful.
you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Sandy.
it was really
Jeff,
an
Have a good
interesting book.
week.
You too.
I enjoyed it. I
Right.
always learn something.
That's
You.
good.
Always.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Good.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
And some of our guesses about why he was doing what he was doing were correct.
I know. Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
nice. Anyway, bye you guys.
Bye, Alice.
Alice.